Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to first give a couple housekeeping items before we begin and I introduce our presenter today. Just a reminder on how to ask questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a panel, and in that panel, there is a box where you can type in the questions. Please feel free to type questions in at any time, and Dr. Troyer will answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, as a reminder, your portal will not be updated for about 7 to 10 business days. We have a very lot of you on this call, and it does take us time to get everything updated and to have your certificates mailed out. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jason Troyer. Dr. Troyer is a grief expert, author, former psychology professor, and therapist. He helps funeral homes and cemeteries connect with their communities through his grief resources and Facebook services. He also provides community presentations, professional workshops, and trainings. He works at Smith Funeral and Cremation Service and Grandview Cemetery in Maryville, Tennessee. Dr. Troyer can be reached at drjasontroyer@gmail.com. He earned his PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Kansas and his master's degree in counseling from Truman State University. And he will be speaking on battling burnout and building resilience, which is something I know we can all use today. Welcome, Jason.
Kelly, thanks so much. Thanks so much to the New York State Funeral Directors Association for the invitation to be with you today. Like Kelly mentioned, I'm coming to you from Maryville, Tennessee, which is just south of Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm about 20 minutes away from the Smoky Mountain National Park, kind of on the west side of the park, kind of on the quiet side of the park, if you've ever had the chance to come down to the Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge area. Like Kelly mentioned, I work with quite a few funeral homes, almost 200 funeral homes across the country, helping them with their Facebook services and grief support and other things. And what I've been hearing, even before the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic started, is a lot about the challenges of the work you do day in and day out. And then, of course, over the last 2 years, the additional challenges and burdens they've been dealing with. So if ever this was a timely topic, I think it's now. Hopefully, we're getting to the point where you are able to catch your breath a little bit, catch up on some things that you've had to put off for a while. And I think an important part of that is catching up on self-care. So let's talk about specifically burnout and resilience related to funeral service. And I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. I'm also happy to address questions in a more personal way. I know this is kind of a very public forum, and so if you have some way you want to contact me later, I would welcome that. So, why would funeral professionals feel burned out? That may seem like a really stupid question, but what I've discovered in the fact that I work part-time in a funeral home cemetery combo here in East Tennessee is, as I look around at my colleagues, so often you are head down in the work, and yes, it's stressful and challenging, but you don't even kind of have time to kind of really think about what the reasons would be. So let's go through a few of the areas where stress may be coming into your life. And of course, these may not all apply depending on the various hats that you wear, but let's see how many of them may apply in your specific situation. For a lot of funeral professionals, there's just a lot of paperwork that comes with the job. And if you're an owner or a manager, then there's even more than that. Tax forms, HR forms, all sorts of things that come along with that, let alone making sure you're working on your budget, accounts receivable, those sorts of things. These days, it seems like there's almost like a new social media channel added every year, every couple of months. Should I be on TikTok? Should I be on Twitter, LinkedIn, let alone Facebook, YouTube, and all the other options, not to mention the smaller ones that are out there, but we keep hearing about. And so it used to be pretty straightforward. We had newspapers, yellow pages, and maybe a few other local sorts of things we did. And these days, it seems like there's so many more options to be dealing with. with the pandemic, even before that, but certainly with the pandemic, if you're offering these extra services like live streaming to your families, all of a sudden you've got to become an expert on technology, or work with an outside vendor. But still, there's probably a lot that you need to do. One more thing to worry about: is it working? Is it not working? Should I offer it? Those sorts of things. Of course, always in mind, we want to keep ourselves and our colleagues safe. We have a much better understanding of things like COVID right now, but certainly at the beginning, we just really didn't have a lot of information about how it spread, and the various ways that we needed precautions we needed to take to keep ourselves safe, let alone all the other diseases and concerns that are kind of an ever-present worry that we have to deal with in the prep room. Sometimes you feel like you need to be wearing a striped shirt and wear a whistle. Everything I hear from folks across the country is that increasingly families are more likely to have conflict in the arrangement room. That might be, and in other places during the service, after the service, those sorts of things. Whether that is them arguing amongst themselves, arguing directly with you and your colleagues, it just seems like the stress has been turned up. And so I actually have a whole different presentation on diffusing conflict in the arrangement room, because that has been such a prevalent concern across the country. Sometimes you feel like you need to have like private security on a speed dial. I don't know about New York, but here in Tennessee, we have folks come in and they say, the so-and-so better not show up or there's going to be a heap of trouble. And we know that we need to take them seriously in those situations. I didn't know before working in a funeral home that you could have holes punched in walls and chairs thrown and doors torn off hinges and those sorts of things. Thankfully, it doesn't happen too often, but it certainly does happen. These days, people are just seems to be so much more likely to get aggressive, get violent, those sorts of things. And how often, increasingly, we are serving a much more diverse, religiously community. Often you are in a situation where you're kind of educating the family about some of their own rituals from their faith traditions, or maybe educating the next generation who's not aware of what would be typical in those situations. Along with people being more likely to have more conflict, we see an increasing tendency for people to be, or at least threaten litigation. And so they're very quick to say, you're going to be hearing from my lawyer, or I'm going to sue you, or those sorts of things. Sometimes they follow through, sometimes they don't, but we always have to be really careful about our practices, but also kind of be worried about folks, instead of kind of working through a simple mistake, then kind of taking it to kind of more of an extreme level, or saying that they're going to sue you for something you have no control over, or something that's completely unrealistic. I think it's absolutely true that funeral professionals, there's this comparison that you plan the equivalent of a wedding, but you do it in under a week. And so you're constantly keeping track of various details for folks, for the families that you serve, and the services that you are kind of creating with them. And of course, every detail is important. It's very critical to that family to have a certain song played, or to have their mother or grandmother dressed in a certain way, or all these numerous details we got to keep track of, and they're all important. I always say, even though I'm trained as a grief psychologist, that funeral professionals will do more informal grief counseling than almost any therapist will do. And that's because you're just there with the families. You're just kind of in the room with them, whether it's a viewing or a wake or those sorts of situations, whether it's at when you're taking their loved one into your care at removal, whether you're kind of waiting around after at the cemetery, those sorts of things. You're just there. And so the questions are going to come up, the topics are going to come up, and they're assuming that you're comfortable and knowledgeable because you're in the field that you're in. And so it's kind of another something to you feel like you have to be ready for all the time. It's a very physically demanding job. I don't have to tell you this, even though that's a piano that he's pushing. The challenges are similar: going up and down stairs, moving individuals who are in your care, moving the merchandise, including caskets and those sorts of things. Just takes a physical toll. And how's that work-life balance going? I mean, it just, in some ways, it just doesn't even seem like it can really apply to funeral professionals, given that I really struggle to think of other especially family businesses that really do need to stay open 24/7, 365, or at least be reachable and be ready to help out families all the time. And so it is really challenging to kind of create any sort sense of physical or psychological distance from your business. You might get a chance to go out to dinner or take the day off and not go to the funeral home, but because we all have these are, I don't know if you can see my picture, but we have like these wonderful and terrible devices on us that, called cell phones that make us reachable at any moment. And so psychologically, we're often kind of tied to work in those ways. We've got people that we care about who love us, our own loved ones, who wish they probably had a little bit more time and a little bit more of our attention. And it's difficult to explain that we need to be available to other families who desperately need us on those days as well, and feeling kind of pulled between serving our community and those families, as well as spending time with our own families. And for those of you, especially those of you who do a lot of work in the prep room, there's probably an image that is already kind of burned on your mind, that even if I know you're used to it, I know that you may say that it doesn't bother you, and maybe it really doesn't, but I would argue that there are some things that you have seen that will take a psychological toll. And all I can say is thank you for being there, for kind of making folks perhaps viewable, or in some ways kind of taking care of their loved ones so that their family doesn't have to see their loved one in that state. But I would argue that there's some stress that comes with that, even if it's something that you do on a daily or weekly basis. And it all leads up to this, which is if you do your job well, if you are dedicated to your community and do a good job, then you become the person that the families in your community rely on. So they think of you as, you're my guy, you're my gal, you're the person who I'm going to call on to take care of my closest loved ones. And that's a beautiful thing, to build up that trust. But sometimes we don't think about the flip side of that. It's a double, the flip side of the coin, or the double-edged sword part of this, is that because they trust you, we feel compelled to always be there for them, which means it can be difficult to, when our spouse says, I'd really like to go on kind of that dream cruise and take 10 days away and not be able to drive back here, it makes it hard for us sometimes to get away, because we have fostered this trust in our community. And so it's great, and yet it can also feel a little bit like an anchor that kind of ties you to your place of work and ties you to your community, when there might be times when you really would like to take a little bit of a break. So I don't like it when speakers kind of trick people. This isn't really a trick, but I'm setting you up for something here. So forewarning, what I would argue with is, I would say statement A here is that funeral professionals encounter extraordinary stress and trauma. What I'm saying with that is that the general public really has no idea what you deal with. And a lot of times they will say, well, I can't be a funeral director because I can't deal with dead, icky bodies. And most funeral directors that I know, most funeral professionals that I know would say, it's not the deceased that give me trouble. It's usually the living who are the major source of stress. But all that, whatever perspective we're coming from, the general public has no idea what you deal with. And I absolutely agree with statement A. I think it is a job that only a select few people can do. I think the vast majority of you do it because you feel called to do it. And so you do, it's a challenging job, and you do encounter extraordinary circumstances as part of your profession. What I would argue is that if you agree with me on statement A, then we can't say that statement B is true. If you encounter extraordinary stress and trauma, then we actually do need to take precautions to avoid long-term stress and burnout. We actually have to fight against this idea of kind of a just deal with it, or just kind of shake it off, or those sorts of things. In fact, we need to kind of address it much more directly. Now, I want to be really clear about what I mean by this, because there's a lot of kind of this old school mentality that I really like. I like old school, start a business with dedicated service, you build up a reputation over the course of years or maybe multiple generations, and you build trust with your community, and your community rewards you by choosing you to serve them when the time comes. I love everything about that, and I think you deserve whatever rewards you would get from that hard work. That I like. The small part of the old school piece I don't think serves us very well is that when we say, things like you just knew what you were getting into when you got into the profession. This is just part of the job. Because the reality is that at this point, the reality is that we've got fewer new funeral professionals coming in, people deciding to be first generation, people switching. I think there's a lot of great clergy, for example, nurses, former clergy, other folks who would make great, former military who would make great funeral professionals, but they're kind of looking at the field and seeing the stress and some of the job conditions, and they're saying, no, that's just not a possibility. We're also seeing pretty high turnover, whether that is people leaving funeral service or maybe kind of job jumping, trying to find, thinking the grass is greener somewhere else, when there's just going to be a fair amount of stress everywhere. And even if those two things aren't true, then we're still seeing people who are kind of suffering without support. So what I would offer is this new perspective. You absolutely are a select few that do an extraordinary job under difficult circumstances. And we've also got to recognize that the duties of this profession and the nature and the environment of the profession are going to put you at a higher risk for compassion fatigue and burnout. So we've got to very intentionally work to reduce compassion stress. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges, but I promise we're going to get to some solutions here in just a second. I've been throwing around the term burnout, probably helps to give us a little bit of an idea of what it is. Certainly, I think it is something that is generally progressive over a longer period of time. It is going to affect you mind, body, and spirit, and certainly kind of in all aspects of your life. And burnout is one of those tricky terms where it might mean, I'm a little bit stressed out and it would be nice if I had a day off, all the way to I'm going to quit tomorrow. I mean, we kind of have this huge range of kind of the severity of burnout, so to speak, or the severity of kind of job-related stress. But taking just briefly a little bit closer look, it's actually going to affect us, absolutely going to affect us in our body, certainly going to kind of create some physical exhaustion. Even though you're exhausted, it might create problems with sleeping. Anything kind of stress related in terms of other ailments, it's going to make those even worse. And so if we've got other problems that are kind of exacerbated by stress, certainly the symptoms of burnout are going to make those worse. So emotional and psychological symptoms: difficulty concentrating, forgetful, irritability. If you already have some concerns with mild or moderate depression or anxiety, it's going to make those worse. And I think more of these psychological kind of / spiritual symptoms of the hopelessness and the helplessness and kind of feelings of being kind of spiritually empty. Specifically looking at funeral service, one of the biggest challenges with feelings of burnout, especially more moderate or severe burnout, is that you don't really have the energy to empathize with the families that you're working with, because empathy takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to kind of connect with them, kind of feel with them in that supportive sort of way, and it just takes a lot of energy. It might make it so that you feel ineffective when you're trying to work with folks. If other people around you seem to be happy or fulfilled in their job, we can easily get resentful of them. For those of you who do a lot more restorative work or prep work, we might have some symptoms similar to PTSD, like nightmares. As with any other source of kind of significant amount of stress, we might unfortunately kind of slip into some bad habits, using substances in a way to deal with the stress that become more and more problematic. Being cynical about what you do. And I think one of the worst things that burnout does is every funeral professional that I know, if they've had one of those really rough weeks, or maybe 2 weeks in a row, like the saving grace is being able to kind of finally go home at the end of the day and say, in the time when that family needed me, I was there for them. We put together a service that started their healing process, and I can really be proud of that. But unfortunately, what burnout can do is kind of rob you of that ability to kind of get those warm fuzzies after you've done a good job. Even if you're kind of physically exhausted, it's like, we stepped up, we really did a good job today. Now I need to go sleep for 10 hours. but burnout can kind of rob you of that opportunity to take satisfaction or pride in a job well done. And so you kind of lose that restorative nature of kind of that pride or satisfaction at the end. Just for a moment, I want to take briefly kind of look at how other fields are dealing with this. Now, no one is doing it perfectly, but I think it helps to know, most kind of state law enforcements and local law enforcements, certainly the US military, certainly US organizations like federal marshals and the FBI, all of those organizations are very focused on burnout and job stress. They are doing trainings. They are, just one example, in the state of Tennessee, at kind of at the state and local level, they've trained 50,000 people how to do critical stress debriefing and also kind of help fellow officers out related to job stress, and especially with critical incidents. So that's just a kind of an indication of how seriously they're taking it, how much time and energy they're taking it. What I mean by all of this is that the very tough men and women who are in law enforcement, the US military, US federal marshals, and other offices are taking burnout seriously. And so I think that makes it, helps make it okay for the tough men and women of funeral service to also take it seriously. It's not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of kind of helping our best and brightest stay in the field and care for each other because you do a difficult job. You're in a difficult profession. Briefly talking to the managers and owners, a couple of things that you can be doing to kind of help yourself and help your colleagues. The number one thing you can do is just simply recognize that this profession is stressful, and also acknowledge and share your own reactions. If you are talking about job stress, compassion fatigue as if they're real things and we're not making light of them, it, like everything else, you kind of set the tone for your staff in terms of, is this something okay to talk about? Is this something okay to get help for? Those sorts of things. So simply talking about that, this was a rough week. I hope everyone, I hope you get it, get some time to yourself tomorrow, those sorts of things. Looks like we're light tomorrow, maybe you need to take the day off. Those sorts of things are some of the most powerful things you can do, is just kind of create a culture where it's okay to talk about job stress, where it's not dismissed. Model self-care as best you can. I know that owners and managers, certainly feel compelled to set a good example. I would argue that part of that being a good example is also modeling self-care and making sure you get as much time as reasonably possible with the people you care about outside of work. Look for specific situations that might be stressful for individual individual colleagues. If your embalmer is unfortunately back in the prep room, working with a 6-year-old child who died, and they've got a 5-year-old child at home, recognize that might obviously be a difficult situation. Maybe it's, if you're able to, maybe it's a situation where you can ask them to switch out and maybe take a different case. Maybe that's not possible. So at minimum, just kind of check in with them before and after and say, I know this might be difficult for you. Give them the opportunity. I'm not asking you to do deep therapy. I'm asking you to just check in and acknowledge that this might be difficult. And if they want to talk a little bit, just listen with an open heart. I think that's probably the most important thing you can do in that situation. Provide some training and resources, support some worthy causes, especially things that might not be death related, something really positive in the community, and certainly encouraging that self-care. Just a few more things. I would just remind you to treat your employees, your colleagues, at least as well as you treat your customers. I know it's true. We want to keep families happy because they might, these days, they're going to post on social media, or they're going to tell people around the community that they didn't have a good experience. And I understand that. But recognize that if you have one or more burned out employees, but they're still working, those burned out employees are going to affect every family that they work with. And they're not going to be your kind of putting their best foot forward or kind of presenting your firm in the best light if they're burned out. Let alone the fact they're expensive to replace. I don't have to tell you, it's difficult to find good people these days. And every employee that you have has a social network within the community. And so maybe, if they're burned out, there might be a reasonable chance that they might be saying bad things about the firm around the community. And so if they're not, if we're not kind of dealing with the challenges there, it might really be kind of bad for marketing. As best we can, try to provide them with reasonable workloads. I know that's easier said than done, especially during pandemic situations and spikes in workload, those sorts of things. Provide them with some stress reduction resources. I know I'm preaching to the choir here since you're watching this, but yeah. Some of the costs of inaction, we've gone through a few of these, but certainly customer service. Burned out employees do not provide great customer service. Staff are more likely to be at each other's throats if one or more of them is burned out. It's like I mentioned before, it's going to exacerbate some existing mental health concerns or create mental health concerns, as well as physical health concerns that might already be there. And not only that, but it's going to have an effect on their relationships outside of work with their spouses or partners out there, with their extended family, those sorts of situations, all the stress that they're dealing with there. It's all too easy for substance abuse to creep in as a way to deal with that stress, as a way to kind of be able to get to sleep or kind of take the edge off those sorts of things. And, you know, it really is a difficult situation when you might feel like the odd one out. What I love going to funeral director conventions because I love to stand near the main door. I love to go to the opening event and see funeral directors from across the state kind of connect with those buddies, those people that they know mainly from the convention. And it's kind of like you walk in and you talk with folks and maybe you share a little bit about your family and share how work is going and those sorts of things. And you're talking with people who really understand it. Because in normal circumstances, if you're in the backyard barbecue at somebody's house, you know, the tax accountant can complain about tax season and the teacher can complain about parents or students, but nobody really wants to hear about what funeral professionals do. And on top of that, of course, you need to maintain some confidentiality. You're not kind of sharing everyone's business around town. But even if that's not a concern, nobody wants to hear about kind of the pressures of what funeral directors do. So it's so important to kind of be able to have a tight staff where you can share amongst each other, to belong to professional organizations where you can go get advice, blow off a little steam, and connect with people who really understand. You know, with just a short story, they know exactly what you're talking about. Just a reminder, burnout and compassion fatigue can affect everybody, whether it's front office staff, folks, pre-need professionals, if you got grounds crew, those sorts of folks. It can be stressful for everybody. Everybody's dealing with families. Everyone's dealing with families who are in crisis. And so that stress can come through on everybody. So a couple of sources of stress we've talked about, all the various hats that you wear that we covered at the beginning. The challenge of finding physical and psychological time away from your facility, and the challenges of being kind of psychologically connected through your phone or other devices. Some other things is that most funeral professionals that I know would say, you know, it's the satisfaction of serving a family is what keeps me going. You know, being there for them when they really need us is what kind of refills me, so to speak. And so I know that you've all seen examples of families coming together and caring for you and being thankful for what you do. But at the same time, you know, again, flip side of the same coin, families are also probably your biggest source of stress. You know, when they're not agreeing, when they're fighting you on everything, when they're fighting with each other, those sorts of things. So, you know, unfortunately, we can't pick and choose necessarily which ones we're going to serve or necessarily know who's walking through the door. But families, you know, they're under stress. They come together and they have to make some big decisions and agree on those things. Sometimes we get, you know, sometimes I call the long lost daughter, the long lost son. You know, somebody flies in from California and kind of disrupts the plans at the last minute, even though they haven't been in the picture for months or years, those sorts of things. Other things we're seeing is kind of very psychologically when we talk about family dynamics. When you have someone in the family die, we also lose their role. So maybe we have a grandmother who dies and she's like the family matriarch and she's the one who makes all the big decisions in this family. Well, when the matriarch dies, who's going to take that place? Who's going to now step up and start filling those roles? And so you have a front seat to these changing family dynamics, and healthy families will kind of adjust pretty well. Unhealthy families will tend to have a lot of conflict there. And of course, another psychological thing we see is a lot of displaced grief and anger. It's very normal part of grieving to be angry at the deceased. They might be angry. I told you to go to the doctor. I told you to, wear a seatbelt or whatever it is. And so they're mad, but in our society, it's not okay to be mad at the deceased. And so that anger's got to go somewhere. So, you're in the arrangement room with them. And so it comes out at you, whether it's, usually in an unjustified sort of way. So all these sources can kind of come in here. Certainly the challenges of relationships with our coworkers, staff members and owners, whether or not people are a good fit for funeral service, that can be an ongoing question. Sometimes that's a question of, should I be in the prep room or should I be out front more, or vice versa? Did they enter the profession with reasonable expectations for what this entails? Those are all some open questions there. I would encourage, owners and managers to kind of look at, just as one example, look at your schedule. If you haven't changed your work schedule for 15, 20 years, I would encourage you just to take a look at that. I don't know the right answer for you in your situation, but I bet a lot of other funeral homes that have about the same number of staff, the same number of resources as you do, and ask around and just kind of see, maybe there's a schedule that kind of provides better coverage and everyone on the staff and the owners like better, and we just hadn't tried it for a while. So ask around to your colleagues to see if there's something there. I posted on a Facebook group for funeral professionals once. I said, just, in 2 sentences, tell me your schedule. And there were like 20 different schedules that people described. And so there's a lot of variety out there that you might look at. Other non-work stressors, there might be stress coming from outside. So what I really want to focus on here is, okay, what do we do about it? Jason, you've completely stressed me out at this point. You've reminded me of all the reasons why I'm stressed out. What do we do? So the first thing we do is take a deep breath, get a little water. I try to keep it as simple as possible as we're focusing on resilience. We can't take stress out of funeral service. So what we want to do is kind of build up our resources so that we can bounce back from those tough weeks, those tough days. I have 2 processes for building resilience. The first one is to refill. And we're going with the well metaphor here, or you can't pour from an empty cup sort of a thing. As you are giving yourself to families, to working with colleagues, as you're kind of giving that energy out there, being empathetic with folks, we've got to be constantly refilling ourselves on like a daily or even hourly basis, because that's where the energy is going on a daily or hourly basis. So we need those moments where we can just stop and catch a cup of coffee, or just kind of complain a little bit about this. If you're an owner, manager, or colleague, make it okay. Now, within a certain amount of reason. We don't want, if somebody's complaining about every family who walks through the door, then maybe they're not cut out for funeral service. But within reason, we want to, if your staff or your colleagues are complaining to you, then they're not kind of punching back to a family, so to speak. And so we absolutely want that to kind of be a safe place where they can blow off that steam. Maybe it's overpriced dessert instead of overpriced coffee, but if you're driving around town doing some errands, you need to stop for some coffee or stop at the local dessert place, do that. That might be, it's just a mental health break. When possible, and hopefully we have some times coming here in the future, when you can get away from the office, sometimes there can be some benefits of kind of slowing down to the nature, to the rhythms of nature, where we kind of get slowed down a little bit. If it's at all possible, if you can kind of not be kind of psychologically connected to the funeral home, and not be on call, not be keeping up with various apps or messages and those sorts of things, that's an ideal thing to do. As you might suspect, the psychologist is going to advocate for counseling. Here's what I would tell you. Most mental health professionals are generalists. They'll deal with a variety of problems, including burnout and stress. And so for most mental health professionals, if you walk in and say, my job is stressful, I need a stress management plan, or I need you to be my stress management consultant, most of them are going to go with you on that. They're going to say, I can work with that. If your perception of therapy is from the movies or TV shows, and that you're going to put your feet up on the couch and talk about dreams about your mom, that's not what therapy is in the vast majority of situations, and certainly probably not necessarily what you need, perhaps. But just like funeral professionals might hire consultants for all sorts of different business-related needs, think of mental health professionals as just another consultant that you can use as kind of a stress management coach or something like that. The research is really strong about the benefits of mindfulness and meditation and prayer, just being still and quiet for a few moments, um, even for very short periods of time, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, can have a kind of a really powerful resetting effect on the brain. I'll keep the studies off to the side, but there have been multiple studies in a variety of disciplines that would say this can be really powerful. So, like I said before, we need to be refilling on a constant basis. So I would encourage you, whether it is it might be a Bible verse of the day app, it might be an inspiration of the day or something like that, or it might be a reminder to kind of do some deep breathing. Look for places when you can do that within the day. I use an example. Maybe you're standing at the back of the church or the chapel or wherever you're having a service. You know that this officiant is probably going to go on for at least 10 or 15 more minutes because you've heard their spiel a couple of times. And so you might just kind of use that moment while you're keeping an eye on making sure everything's going smoothly. Let's do some deep breathing. Let's kind of glance at our phone and look at an inspirational verse or quote or something like that. If you're sitting down at a desk and the Johnsons are coming in at 10:30 and you've got 5 or 10 minutes, pull out something that you've laminated on a card, something like a mindfulness statement or a funeral director's prayer or something like that to kind of get you in the right mindset. We want to kind of be able to kind of pull these things in when you need them. Because yeah, it's great if you've got an hour at night to do kind of a whole evening retreat, or if you can work yoga or something else into your day for an hour each night. Most funeral professionals can't because they've got maybe extended families or other responsibilities, or work goes late. And so we want to try to build those in as much as we can. Along with mindfulness, meditation, prayer, we also see some really powerful effects with writing or journaling. It doesn't have to be a Dear Diary entry like my 13-year-old daughter. It can be, I'll confess, I journal probably about 2 or 3 times a month. And my journal statements are usually just brief bullet points. And usually I journal when I am procrastinating something I really need to work on. I need to journal and kind of write out maybe some of the reasons why I think I might be procrastinating, get myself unstuck in those situations. But having something in your desk, the opportunity to kind of sit and focus on what might be concerning you. If you want to flip that on its head and say, no, I'd rather kind of focus on gratitude, I just want to write it down, great. There's lots of gratitude journals out there with prompts for each day. There are apps out there if you're more comfortable kind of using your phone, those sorts of things. But again, very few minutes of very small investment is enough to kind of chart a course that's entirely different for the rest of the day, kind of turn things around really well. No big surprise, benefits of exercise. The best things are if you can keep it regular. If you can do it social, you're more likely to stick with it and you get some of the social benefits. If you're up to something a little bit more vigorous, there's a few bonus points for kind of burning off some of the stress hormones that just come as part of stress and burnout, but that's not necessarily. Mostly we just want to just do something pretty consistent and ideally something that you find really is worth the time and energy, so to speak. I think also in terms of refilling, spending time with animals and kids, and I specifically point those two out because animals and kids are really focused on the here and now and the present moment. And they're usually not too worried about what happened yesterday, and they're not too worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. And some aspects of burnout can be kind of us kicking ourselves for a mistake we made yesterday or last week, or worried about what's going to happen in the future. And so kind of joining them and being kind of happy and finding joy just in the present moment is kind of really a specialty, especially of young children and our animal companions. So that has been the first process, which is refilling. It's something we need to do on a daily basis or an hourly basis to kind of refill our own glass. The next process is what I call transforming. So this has more to do with kind of changing the vessel. And in this case, you're the vessel. And I know this is going to sound like something a psychologist would say, but another way to think about it is the question, how's my relationship to funeral service? And what I mean by that is, if I had the opportunity, if I had all of you in the room together, what we could do is I could ask the question, do you feel called to be a funeral professional? And I suspect probably over 90% of you would raise your hand, that you feel called to do this, or you feel a special connection. This is more than just a job to you. Well, and I agree with that, and I believe that. In that situation, when what you do is such a part of your core identity, we need to kind of nurture that relationship with our profession, just like we would nurture our relationships with other significant people in our lives, our spouses or partners, our children, our other family, our best friend, those sorts of things. If that relationship with being a funeral professional is that important, we need to be continually working on it. And we need to be doing things like refilling it, kind of adding to it. And we need to do more long-term things that will help it kind of grow and get even better. And this transforming is really tricky, because at a time when you might be feeling a little bit burned out and you don't have very much energy, transforming would argue that the best thing to do is actually reinvest some energy in your profession, but into new things that you would get excited about. And you kind of put in a little bit of energy that you get excited about, and you get more back from it. Let me give you a couple of examples. One might be to focus on a community cause or an event or something like that that you can really get behind. Maybe even something, as much as I love funeral homes doing grief-related events, maybe even something that's outside of that, that has that has kind of just some pure goodness to it, those sorts of things. And getting excited about a new charity drive or a new volunteering for a new organization or something like that. Another thing might be mentoring, whether that's formal or informal, working with, maybe they're an apprentice or just a new professional or somebody who's learning some new skills. It takes a lot of energy to be a good mentor, but for those who really enjoy it, they get more energy back out of it. And it's fun to see how far people have come and how much they've learned, those sorts of things. Again, I'm preaching to the choir here, because learning new skills, maybe that's some new certifications, taking on some new roles within your organization, those sorts of things. It takes energy up front, but it might kind of help you get excited about funeral service again, maybe some of that you had lost. I love to use an example from from the funeral home that I work with. This is my good friend Jenny. Jenny wasn't burned out, but was looking for a new challenge, and so she decided that our funeral home and cemetery needed a support animal. And so she went through the process of finding the support animal, getting him trained appropriately, working with him, taking him to events and those sorts of things. It required a huge amount of energy, but I know that she would say, she got 10 or 20-fold back from bringing, our dog's name is Tuck here, and bringing Tuck to the funeral home. And a side note, for those of you who don't have companion animals, I know there's lots of reasons for and against them. I knew animals would really help our families, and he's been a huge hit with our families of any age. What I really underestimated was his effect on the staff. And so when we don't even have any families in the building, we can get down on our knees and give him a belly rub, or even bring out the tennis ball and throw it down the long hallway or things like that. His effect on everybody, not just the families we serve, but the staff, has been really, really amazing to see. If this was all easy, we'd already be doing it. But so that's wrapping up the transforming part. Now transforming, it takes energy, so we can only do it once in a while. That's not something we can do all the time. We've got our regular job duties, but I would encourage you, if you're an owner or manager and you have someone who comes to you with a new idea, maybe you would think, well, do I want to have them invest time in that, or is it going to cost the firm some money? Maybe it's what they're looking for to kind of stay connected to funeral service, or to stay excited about funeral service. And maybe it's worth kind of carving out 10% of their position or something to kind of let them be excited about this and bring it and benefit the entire staff, the entire firm. If this was easy, you'd already be doing it. And so let's look at some common roadblocks. One, we want to look at, I would encourage you to make kind of small changes as opposed to huge lifestyle changes. Huge lifestyle changes make for great reality TV, but they rarely in real life tend to stick. And so I would encourage you to kind of do some short, small term sorts of things that you can start today or tomorrow. It might be like, I heard that crazy psychologist say that journaling is good. So maybe I've got a journal at home. And so maybe I'll kind of put it in my car, leave it in my desk drawer or something like that. Or I know that a lot of times that for funeral professionals, lunch is whatever is in your desk drawer or whatever's in the break room. And I would just say, okay, if that's the reality, then let's put some healthier options in my drawer or in the break room. Maybe some meal replacement bars instead of huge candy bars or those sorts of things. So these are some small things that we can start to do and then build on those successes. The other thing that I would argue is that we cannot continue to simply add on and on and on more and more. And so we've got to do what I call smart subtraction. You've got to look for some things to take off your plate, if you're an owner or manager, off of your colleagues' plates. Because if we keep adding without subtracting, you're going to break the axles. It's just going to, there are some things that are probably really take a look at, is this worth doing in the long term? Just because we've always done it, is it still worth the time and energy at this point? One way to look at what you should cut is we can borrow some principles from the business world. The Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule is the idea that most things have like an outsized effect from various causes. Let me give you an example. I bet if your funeral home has carpet, I bet 20% of your carpet has 80% of the wear and tear. I bet that 20% of the families you serve create 80% of the problems. I bet if you're an owner or a manager, I bet they would say 20% of your staff cause 80% of your problems. So usually it's not a one-to-one relationship. What we want to do is look for changes where we get an outsized return. When I talk with a lot of funeral professionals, there are two things that tend to jump out at me. This isn't true across the board, but two things. One is, given your difficult schedule, it's difficult to have regular physical activity. I think that would be a 20% investment that would give you a really outsized return. The other thing is that for a lot of folks, and I know it's easier said than done, but time away from work, kind of investing a small amount in that is going to get you a lot of return there. But you'd have to determine for yourself and for kind of yours, a larger staff, what are some places where we can make a small investment and we know that we're going to get a big return. Because the reality is I've got this blue line here, the stress of funeral service will kind of constantly is trying to pull you down. And so what we need to be doing is kind of these refilling sorts of things to kind of get us up just to break even. And once in a while, do something a little bit more transformative that kind of really brings us up. Because if we eventually slide all the way down into this danger zone at the bottom, that's when you're trying to get to work or run your funeral home from the emergency room or from the recovery room. It's just at that point, you're going to have to do something pretty drastic to get back up to even, which is why we've really got to focus on investing in it kind of in these refill and transforming sorts of things on a continual basis. Without question, you've been called to a really a profession that is filled with quite a bit of stress that's unavoidable. There's no way that we can take all the stress out of funeral service. There's some things we can do to take some of it out, but not all of it. Given that, we've got to focus on building resilience so you can bounce back from those especially difficult weeks, those especially difficult cases, those sorts of things. So look for things that kind of you can fit into your schedule that you find personally meaningful, and so use those to kind of refill yourself on an hourly or daily basis. Once in a while, it's really important to do something more transformative where you're actually investing energy in and getting multiples of that back because you're kind of re-engaging and getting re-excited about your relationship with funeral service again. If you're going to make some changes, you might start with some small experiments, build on those successes. It's something you could start right away. Look for things you can take off your plate or your colleagues' plates because we can't just keep adding and adding to it. One of my favorite quotes from Parker Palmer Self-care is never a selfish act. It is simply good stewardship of the only gift I have, the gift I was put on earth to offer others. It's true that if you take better care of yourself, you will have more energy to give to your families, but that's not necessarily the end goal. In my view, you're a human being worthy of love and attention, and so this is something that you should do for yourself primarily. It's going to have the added benefit of, I think, making you probably an even better funeral professional, but the goal should really be to kind of focus on yourself and kind of take stewardship of that. I know that it's been an insane 2 years. I know in particular the New York area has, you bear the brunt of, kind of some of the initial effects of the pandemic, and then Omicron. You always seem to be on the front lines. I've been amazed and astounded at your ability to support one another, to continue to serve your families and your communities. And so on behalf of everyone, all the communities out there, thank you for what you've been doing. And the last thing I'll say is that you deserve to take care of yourself and to take care of each other too. And I hope that you get more time and have the opportunities to do that. So with that, a quick thank you to Kelly and your board for the invitation to be with you today. And I'm looking forward to your questions here in just a moment. If there's something that you want to address with me in a more private way, feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'll turn things back to Kelly.
Thank you so much, Jason. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Troyer, please type them into the question box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen in the panel. I'll wait just a few minutes to see if we have any questions. While I wait, I'll just remind you to please give us 7 to 10 business days for your credit to appear in your portal. I guarantee it'll be there. We just need some time as there are quite a few people on this webinar. Okay, at this time it looks like we have no questions. So thank you so much, Jason, for joining us today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. And again, Dr. Troyer's information is on the screen right now, and you can always feel free to reach out to him or to us here at the association. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Troyer, for all your useful information and knowledge.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a great afternoon.